See, I learned to be suspicious of ways of bettering mankind that require the government to point a gun at innocent people and say, give me your money or I will kill you, which is what taxation always involves ultimately. We don't think of it because we just give them the money. We don't make push come to shove. But if you think it through, you'll realize that if you're adamant, if you're stubborn, if you say, no, I won't pay my taxes, and they issue you a summons, and you say, no, I won't go to court, and they come to arrest you, and you say, no, I won't be arrested, that you're getting perilously close to the point at which they either club you into submission and haul you off to jail, or they shoot you on the spot. Okay? You are not at liberty to decline these blessings. Okay? We're all supposed to pay when told to pay.
How is taxation theft?
How is it not? It's somebody saying, give me your money or I'll hurt you. And it actually came up before when people say, well, but they give us services. All right, well, if that's the justification, then give me $100 and tomorrow I'll give you a moldy sandwich. And then we're good, right? Because as long as I give you something with some of the stolen meat after the fact, then it's okay. And of course, everybody says, well, no, that wouldn't be okay. Okay, well, then stop pretending it's not theft and stop pretending that them giving us something back afterwards retroactively makes armed robbery okay, because that's insane. Again, it's just people sticking up for mythology they were taught that they've never thought about and still haven't thought about. And they repeat stuff. Well, it's called taxation, so it's not the same. Okay, I call that zebra a striped horse. Now is it something different, or is it the same damn thing with different words?
If we're being honest with ourselves, taxation's merely a euphemism for theft, violence, and slavery, the practices upon which it is actually based. And since no individual anywhere on earth has the right to claim ownership of the product of another's labor, such behavior can never be, quote, delegated to a group of people and called a right. Therefore, it follows logically that all forms of taxation, I don't care what they are, excise tax, property tax, gift tax, inheritance tax, income tax, I don't care what form it is, taxes on corporations even, okay? All forms of taxation are always wrong according to natural law because they are all based in the destruction of free will, they are based on coercion, and they are ultimately based upon violence, all of which are wrongdoings. All of which are forms of theft, and all of which not one individual has the right to perform upon another. And this is what people want to justify and believe can be magically turned into a right, just because they want to euphemize it and call it taxation.
This is a copy of the United States Constitution. And what it says, among other things, is that the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes. In other words, a long time ago, a bunch of guys got together and wrote down on a piece of paper, we have the right to rob you. Now, they didn't call it robbery, they called it taxation because it sounds nicer. But it's essentially the same thing. We have the right to take your property from you by force if necessary, without your consent. If you're like 99.999% of the population, you have accepted as unquestionable gospel the notion that this piece of paper gave to some mere mortal human beings the moral right to forcibly confiscate wealth from other people and call it taxation. In fact, if you're like 99.999% of the population, you've never even thought about this until right now. The IRS, it's hundreds of offices across the country, it's 100,000 employees, all the properties they've seized, all the bank accounts they've wiped out, all the people they've prosecuted and thrown in prison, all federal taxes, income, estate, employment, excises, all of them, all federal tax collection stems from this scribble of ink on a piece of parchment. This is supposedly the source of the authority for every bit of that. These few words scrawled on a piece of parchment a couple hundred years ago. By writing this, they claim to bestow upon those people calling themselves Congress a right that you don't have and I don't have. The right to take money by force, if necessary, from other people.
The Internal Revenue Code is a massive part of the laws of the United States of America. It is complex. I dare say no single human being, even the most expert tax lawyer, understands all of it. Many provisions are almost incomprehensible, except perhaps to that most expert tax lawyer. And even he is probably uncertain about many details. Yet one thing is certain. Virtually nothing in the code is there by accident. Every incomprehensible provision is there to serve the interest of someone who made it worthwhile for a politician to direct his staffers to put it there at an opportune point in the legislative process. You didn't determine any of these provisions. Unlike those who did put them in there, often with billions of dollars at stake, you don't count. Your role in the entire taxing affair is simple and normally boils down to two things. One is to pay the amount that the IRS tells you to pay, and the other is to be punished with the penalties and interest if you don't satisfy the IRS. A third, of course, thankfully never reached by most people, is to go to prison for tax fraud. Imagine that. Tax fraud. The mind rebels at the very concept. It's as if Jesse James rode into your town, took everyone's wallet and watch, and then shot a few people for failing to hand over everything the James gang demanded.
I've noticed this really annoying thing that these lefty anti-capitalist channels do when making videos, but what they like to do is put these propaganda images in the background which convey a message that they never try to argue in their video as to send a message to their viewers, then claim that people who point out how nonsensical it is are deflecting. But anyway, as for this propaganda image, private tyrannies do not exist, because in order for oppression to exist, there requires arbitration, since oppression cannot naturally exist and requires a systemic implementation. And the reason for that being is because it defies self-ownership, and self-ownership is an objective conclusion, as I'll explain in a moment. But simply, ethics can be arrived at objectively because, well, logic is objective. This is the reason fallacious reasoning exists, and simply broken reasoning must be rejected as it's internally inconsistent, and internal inconsistencies fundamentally cannot be defended since they pose a contradiction, and contradictions cannot exist in nature. So if someone does, for example, initiate force, they would need structural arbitration in order to stop others from using force to protect themselves or to hold the aggressor accountable. And without the government, private companies have no such method of holding themselves above the law, and the state is the only organization capable of creating arbitration like this on a systemic level, since the state, fundamentally through the social contract, is designed to create its own laws. Could you imagine, for example, if Monsanto killed a bunch of people, then was taken to court and Hugh Grant defended himself with, well, it's not really murder because some of our corporate lawyers say it's legal for us to indiscriminately kill anyone we like at any time for any reason. Well, that is exactly what the state does.
The argument that taxation is theft, and oh boy do I wish that ANCAPs and libertarians would try moving to Somalia for a bit.
Somalia is not, nor was it ever, an anarchist society. Somalia currently has a government, and the period most statists falsely refer to as a period of anarchy, which was Somalia's transitional government period, which lasted from 1991 to 2012, was multiple different governments fighting for centralized control of the country. So not only was there a government, but it's literally the most statist place on earth. The government literally got so big that it started infighting with itself. I mean, for God's sakes, how can you morons say that Somalia was anarchist with a straight face? Because you don't know the facts?
But I'm here to talk about why taxation is not theft.
But taxation is theft. Taxation is the government coercing money out of you, and yes, statists, you may not like it, but it is coercive. You never sign any agreement which allows the state to do this, nor do you have the ability to withdraw any consent, since no agreement existed to begin with. And if you don't pay, you're held at gunpoint, and you'll be either taken to jail or killed if you resist. So, you're held at gunpoint, deprived of your property, so quite literally taxation is theft. I don't see how you can get around that. And just because you LARP in a scary official-looking uniform doesn't make you any less of a thief.
Now, also, you are receiving things in return. It is not theft if you are receiving things in return.
No. Theft is simply when you forcefully take someone else's property. What the thief does with your property after they steal it from you is irrelevant to the fact that they stole it.
You are funding the police department, the fire department, the military defense, social welfare, all kinds of different infrastructure, all kinds of different things. Public roads, you can't tell me you don't use public roads. You can't tell me you didn't call the police, the firefighters,
And as noted before, there is absolutely no reason why these things can't be funded privately and voluntarily.
No, the military defense is something that you can't even choose to do. That's something that defends the country.
Aside from the fact that militaries, like any other organization you just mentioned, can simply be privately or voluntarily funded, what are they defending the country from? Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan, Gulf War, both world wars? Can you name one war which needed to be fought in U.S. history? And wars based in response to state aggression don't count, since those wouldn't exist without a state either. And even if that is the case, that they're simply defending the U.S., what are they defending the U.S. from? Another state taking over? What would be the difference between that and what we have now?
From, obviously being taken over. Now, also, another thing is, you don't have to pay taxes. You can move to another country.
Domestic violence isn't abuse because you can just move to another house. Someone burning your house down isn't arson because you could simply move to another house. Bullying isn't bullying because you could simply move to another school. Yeah, this is a logical fallacy known as ergo decado, and it's surprisingly common as a response from statists. Well, shouldn't find it too surprising considering that these dopes think that you wouldn't have rights without the state.
Now, if you've been in the country and you've received all those goods that the government has given you, then yes, you have to pay taxes or you're going to have to get a punishment because otherwise people wouldn't pay taxes.
Great, so you just BTFO'd your own argument by admitting that taxation is theft since force is required to sustain it. Also, nice circular logic.
So here's what taxation is. It's not what I believe it is. I'm getting down to the heart of the matter and describing what it actually is. Taxation is the claim that a specific group of people who call themselves government have been given a, quote, right. They've been delegated a right, okay? We've written down a law, and we say this people calling themselves government and the IRS have a right to do this particular action, this activity, okay? This behavior. They've been given a right to confiscate unwillingly, I might add, an arbitrarily chosen percentage of the product of another individual's labor. Now, let me just start with this, right? You ask anybody, how many are you going to voluntarily pay more taxes? Nobody will raise their hand. And you say, why not? Well, because I can barely afford to pay the ones I'm paying now, and I don't want to volunteer any more money toward that endeavor. Quite frankly, I want my resources for myself to use as I see fit voluntarily. But if the government then said, well, your taxes are going up by 5%, how many people would pay them? Most people would. Because subconsciously or consciously, they recognize they're under coercion. They're actually under duress. They're being told that if they don't give this at the command of the people who are confiscating it, that some form of violence will be conducted upon them, whether through the form of fining them and saying, we're going to take more of your resources, whether by saying, we're going to throw you in a cage and make you stay there for as long as we say you need to stay there, okay? Or by actually conducting actual physical harm upon them. So, again, we're saying that this quote-unquote right is given to individuals who call themselves government, and then they have the right to confiscate this arbitrarily chosen percentage of the product of another individual's labor. Because that's what money is, okay? Or that's what, whatever we make through what we work, that's the product of our labor. We work and then we get compensated for it. So that's an exchange for labor that we have done. That's our property, because we gave labor in return for that. So this is done whether or not the other agrees to share that product voluntarily. It's not a voluntary process. Coercion is involved. Taxation is enforced by the threat of violence, which is behavior that will result in bodily harm, or imprisonment, which is the taking away of physical freedom of movement, if those from whom the product is being seized attempt to resist this confiscation. This practice is always, quote, justified, and the word justify actually breaks down etymologically. It means, the word justify means to create a right. That's what justify actually means. Jus in Latin means right or law. And then facere means to create or to make. So to justify means to create right, to make a right up and conjure it into existence. So it's always justified or made into a right, quote unquote, by those who claim that such a practice is necessary and required to, quote unquote, uphold the common good. This is the justification offered for the seizure of the product of people's labor involuntarily. Now, if we are honest with ourselves, if we define the concept of slavery, and I think this is a good definition for slavery, would it be fair to say slavery is the involuntary confiscation of 100% of the product of the labor of another human being? That be a fair definition? You're saying you're working, I'm going to take whatever you generate as a result of that work that you're doing. It doesn't belong to you. The product of your labor doesn't belong to you. All of it belongs to me. So you work for me. I take everything that you have been able to amass or create through the labor that you have done. I think everybody here would agree that's slavery. That's as good as a definition of slavery as you're probably going to get. I mean, we can come up with some other definitions that involve coercion and physically shackling and keeping people. But if we really are honest with ourselves, what is the purpose of slavery to begin with is to make others work for free and then take all of the product of the labor. That's what slavery was conducted for. Okay? So, if we're defining slavery as the involuntary confiscation of 100% of the product of the labor of another human being, we should be able to clearly see that there is no magical percentage to which we could lower this number that would no longer make it slavery. So I ask people, if the person who's saying I'm going to confiscate 100% of your labor and keep it for myself would say, well, I'm going to take 75%. I'll take 3/4. You can keep 1/4 of what you've created. Would that no longer constitute slavery? And I don't care what you say I'm going to use the 75% for. Okay? If you're telling somebody you have no choice, 75% of your labor belongs to me, would that no longer be slavery just because they allow them to keep 25? Okay, let's lower it to 50. Is it still slavery? Okay. Well, what percentage could it possibly be lowered to for it not to be slavery anymore? Only 0. There is no percentage that it could be lowered to for it not to constitute slavery. And again, if we're being honest with ourselves, many people want to justify this in many ways by saying, oh, it's used for services. Services which someone doesn't have a right to refuse. You know, I tell people, hey, if I said to you, I'm a computer technician. You own a computer? Okay. I'm now your computer technician. You're not allowed to refuse my services. Just think about that for a moment. You may not refuse that I am now providing the service for your computer to keep it in good shape. Okay? First of all, what have I just taken from that gentleman? Right to choose. Free will. Right there. That's slavery. I don't even have to keep going and say, hey, if you refuse, or, you know, whether you want or don't want my computer services, I'm now your technician, and I need $200 every year. I'll come over a couple of times. I don't care whether you're happy with my service or not, okay? And if you don't pay me, I'm coming and taking the computer. Now, is that really your property if you're living under that kind of duress? Or am I just the violent criminal who's saying I'm going to steal your stuff if you don't give me what I say? I'm holding you under extortion. That's duress. That's called duress. It means I am threatening violence unto the person unless they conform to my will. And that's what we're all held under. We're held under duress. All forms of taxation are duress. It is a master class telling people you have no right to refuse the arbitrarily set confiscation of your labor that I deem is going to be necessary for what I say it's necessary for. So how could you possibly claim that your home belongs to you if you're paying something called a property tax? That somebody is saying, for the services we provide in this community, you must pay us this percentage, and if you don't pay it, your house is going to be turned over to the government. And it's, you know what that's called? There's a term for that, okay? When a society doesn't actually have true private property ownership rights, and a higher class of masters actually owns the land and owns the property and only allows the peasant class to live upon the property for as long as they pay tribute to the master class, who can tell me what system of government that is? That's called feudalism. And that's the United States government and just about every government on the earth. You live in feudalism. There's no such thing as democracy. There's certainly not a constitutional republic, that's for sure. Okay? The de facto state of government, which means indeed, in action, is feudalism. And feudalism is just another euphemism. It's a euphemism for slavery. Okay? Because slaves aren't allowed to own property. Slaves aren't allowed to keep the product of their labor.
First of all, without the state, you have no property rights. There is no such thing as property rights.
This is complete nonsense. As mentioned earlier, ethics are objective because logic is objective. An objective ethic which exists is self-ownership, since it requires arbitration for someone to not be a self-owner. If you aren't a self-owner, someone else must own you, which proposes an internal inconsistency, since there's no objective explanation for this double standard. Property rights are derived from self-ownership, since property is created as a product of the individual's own autonomy by either voluntarily trading with others or creating the property themselves. This being the case, if you create private property, this being property which is created as a product of self-ownership and not force, you own it, and you can do whatever you want with it as long as you're not violating someone else's rights with it. This is an inescapable conclusion because to deny this would be to propose a logical inconsistency. This is why anarchist societies in the past, such as Celtic Ireland, had private property without a state.
The state creates these property rights, and this is something that libertarians often stumble on.
What the fuck are you talking about? This is something libertarians go over with you statists all the time, and some of the oldest books in libertarian theory go over this exact topic, as I've just explained it.
You ask them, hey, how would there be property rights without the government? And they have no answer, and they often stutter very much because they can't explain this.
I'll take shit that never happened for 500, please.
So the state provides the landscape of property rights and everything in it.
No, the state does not produce property rights, and property is only produced by private individuals. The state does not have any ability to produce private property since it has no resources and inherently relies on the forceful appropriation of private property from individuals who produce it from their own voluntary exchanges.
Which means that everything that you do, you are including the state.
Except the state's interference is not an objectively provable conclusion and is not required for said interaction to occur and contributes nothing to the said interaction. Say, for example, I just want to buy some food from a local producer who produced the food with their own material. Where does the state need to be involved in that interaction? Nowhere. I want food so I can feed myself and maybe my family, and they want to exchange their food for my money since they need money to maintain a living and to continue producing more food to sustain their existence. There is absolutely no reason whatsoever why the state needs to be involved in this interaction. With this being the standard for any and all exchanges, this then proposes the question, why does the state need to exist? And quite simply, it doesn't. Individuals are more than capable of doing for themselves voluntarily everything that the state currently quote-unquote provides, and better, since decentralized voluntary trade comes with innovation and competition, since that is the natural conclusion of the producer's incentive to keep producing and attracting more customers to sustain their own existence. State products don't have this since they're guaranteed an income regardless of the quality of the service they provide.
So when you sign a contract with your employer or your employee or whoever, everything is attached to the state because the state creates the whole landscape of property rights and everything that goes on in the state.
Let's say that this is true hypothetically. It's not, as I've previously explained, but that's the point of hypotheticals. So, you're arguing that the state established an idea. Because of this, they're entitled to everything that came from that idea. Guess that means you should hand that computer you created this video on over to IBM since they created PCs. They obviously have a right to own every PC that's ever been made, regardless of if they were involved in the production or not.
Don't you just love it when people condescend to you after you've said, for example, that people pay taxes or obey regulations at gunpoint? When they demand to know, has anyone from the government pointed a gun at you to make you pay taxes or obey regulations? This sort of response is hard to take seriously. Even if one has never encountered evidence of police carting folks off to jail for such violations of law, one might make the time to read the sanctions expressed in the statutes. Fines and imprisonment. Does anyone really imagine that enforcement of such sanctions is carried out by unarmed government agents? Yes, normally people either obey the government's laws or regulations, or when charged with violations, submit to the legal process that imposes fines or tosses them into prison. Why then go along peacefully is no mystery. Determined resistance would bring forth the government's violence in an instant. So in fact, the gun is always there and always known to be there. And whenever the government requires or forbids anything, especially when it categorizes an action as a felony, as it has done for hundreds, maybe thousands of actions, many with no victim except the grasping and intrinsically violent state itself.
Even if an individual is never personally victimized by law enforcement, never has a run-in with the police, and sees little if any direct impact by government upon his day-to-day life, the myth of authority still has a dramatic impact, not only in his own life, but also on how the existence affects the world around him. For example, the millions of compliant subjects who feel an obligation to surrender a portion of what they earn to the state, to pay their fair share of taxes, continually fund all manner of endeavors and activities which those people would not otherwise fund, which almost no one would otherwise fund, and which therefore would not otherwise exist. By way of taxes, those claiming to be government confiscate an almost incomprehensible amount of time and effort from the millions of victims and convert it into fuel for the agenda of the ruling class. For example, millions of people who oppose war are compelled to fund it via taxation. The product of their time and effort is used to make possible something they morally oppose.
The government denies the natural right of human beings to live on this planet. This it does by denying their natural right to those things that are indispensable to the maintenance of life. It says that, for everything necessary to the maintenance of life, they must have a special permit from the government, and that the government cannot be required to grant them any other means of living than it chooses to grant them. The government denies the natural right of individuals to take possession of wilderness land, and hold and cultivate it for their own subsistence. It asserts that wilderness land is the property of the government, and that individuals have no right to take possession of or cultivate it, unless by special grant of the government. And if an individual attempts to exercise this natural right, the government punishes him as a trespasser and a criminal. The government has no more right to claim the ownership of wilderness lands than it has to claim the ownership of the sunshine, the water, or the atmosphere. And it has no more right to punish a man for taking possession of wilderness land and cultivating it without the consent of the government than it has to punish him for breathing the air, drinking the water, or enjoying the sunshine without a special grant from the government. In thus asserting the government's right of property in wilderness land, and in denying men's right to take possession of and cultivate it, except on first obtaining a grant from the government, which grant the government may withhold if it pleases, the government plainly denies the natural right of men to live on this planet. By denying their natural right to the means that are indispensable to their procuring the food that is necessary for supporting life. In asserting its right of arbitrary dominion over that natural wealth that is indispensable to the support of human life, it asserts its right to withhold that wealth from those whose lives are dependent upon it. In this way, it denies the natural right of human beings to live on the planet. It asserts that government owns the planet, and that men have no right to live on it, except by first getting a permit from the government. This denial of men's natural right to take possession of and cultivate wilderness land is not altered at all by the fact that the government consents to sell as much land as it thinks it expedient or profitable to sell, nor by the fact that, in certain cases, it gives outright certain lands to certain persons. Notwithstanding these sales and gifts, the fact remains that the government claims the original ownership of the lands, and thus denies the natural right of individuals to take possession of and cultivate them. In denying this natural right of individuals, it denies their natural right to live on the earth, and asserts that they have no other right to life than the government, by its own mere will, pleasure, and discretion, may see fit to grant them. In thus denying man's natural right to life, it of course denies every other natural right of human beings, and asserts that they have no natural right to anything, but that, for all other things as well as for life itself, they must depend wholly upon the good pleasure and discretion of the government.